The vampire king had ruled for 3 centuries without ever bowing to anyone. Until Mia accidentally spilled her latte on his leather jacket outside the bookstore, looked him dead in the eyes, and said the one phrase that shattered his carefully constructed walls. Now every supernatural in the city watched as he dropped to one knee, offering her a ring older than most governments. The steam from Mia Chen's untouched plate of dumplings rose like accusatory fingers as her cousin Jenny leaned across the mahogany dining table with that familiar predatory gleam in her eyes. "So tell us about the latest disaster then, Mia," Jenny said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, while the rest of the family quieted their chopsticks to listen. "Was it the guy who turned out to be married, or the one who asked you to split the bill on your birthday dinner?" Heat crawled up Mia's neck as nervous laughter rippled around the table, the sound sharp as breaking glass in the formal dining room of her aunt's Bellevue mansion. "I don't know what you mean," Mia replied, though the lie tasted bitter on her tongue, and she could feel that familiar twist in her stomach that always came when people weren't telling the truth, including herself. "Come on, sweetie," her Aunt Linda chimed in with that condescending tone she reserved for Mia's life choices. "We're just worried about you. You're 28 now and still chasing these fairy tale romances like you're 16. Maybe it's time to be more realistic about your expectations." The words hit like small stones thrown with practiced aim, each one finding its mark in the tender places where Mia kept her dreams carefully protected. She straightened in her chair, feeling the familiar fire that had gotten her through 4 years of literature classes and 7 years of working in a bookstore that barely paid her rent. "I'll find love by Christmas," she announced, her voice stronger than she felt. "Real love, the kind that lasts forever, not some compromise because everyone thinks I should settle." Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The silence stretched taut as a violin string before it snapped into cruel laughter, Jenny leading the chorus while Uncle Robert shook his head with theatrical disappointment. "Oh, Mia," her mother sighed from across the table. "When will you learn that those romance novels you read aren't real life? Prince Charming isn't coming to sweep you off your feet, especially not in Seattle's supernatural district where you insist on working." The laughter grew louder and Mia felt herself shrinking, the way she always did in this room full of successful lawyers and doctors and real estate developers who measured worth in stock portfolios and pristine marriages. But then a warm, weathered hand slipped into hers under the table, and Mia looked up to see her grandmother's dark eyes twinkling with secret knowledge. "Ignore them, little moon," Grandmother Chen whispered in Mandarin, her voice so soft only Mia could hear. "Love finds those who believe in its power, not those who settle for less than their hearts deserve." While the family continued their dissection of Mia's romantic failures, her grandmother pressed something cool and heavy into her palm, closing Mia's fingers around what felt like a ring with intricate metalwork that seemed to pulse with warmth against her skin. "This belonged to your great-grandmother," Grandmother Chen murmured, still speaking their private language, while the others debated whether Mia should try online dating or just get a cat. "She said it calls to those who recognize true worth when they see it. Keep it close, dear one, for the heart knows things the mind cannot understand." Mia slipped the ring into her jacket pocket, feeling oddly comforted by its weight, as the dinner finally ended and she escaped into the cool November air, promising to call more often while knowing she wouldn't until the next mandatory family gathering rolled around. The next morning brought rain that drummed against the windows of Between the Lines bookstore like restless fingers, turning the supernatural district's cobblestone streets into rivers of reflected neon from the various establishments that catered to Seattle's non-human population. Mia pushed through the heavy wooden door that had been painted and repainted so many times the original color was anyone's guess, breathing in the familiar scent of old paper and brewing coffee that always felt more like home than anywhere else. The bookstore occupied the ground floor of a narrow Victorian building, squeezed between a werewolf-run apothecary and a Fae-owned crystal shop, its windows displaying an eclectic mix of supernatural history texts, romance novels, and guidebooks for newly turned vampires navigating modern life. 20 years had passed since the revelation changed everything, when supernatural beings tired of hiding revealed themselves to humanity through carefully orchestrated press conferences and congressional hearings, leading to the integration laws that now governed their interactions with the mortal world. Vampires registered with city halls, werewolves followed lunar schedules for their transformations, and Fae courts operated under strict truth in advertising regulations for their bargains and contracts. Most humans adapted faster than anyone expected, especially in cities like Seattle, where diversity was already a point of pride. Though some rural areas still struggled with the concept of vampire mayors and werewolf police officers. Mia had always felt more comfortable here among the supernatural community than in her family's world of rigid expectations and practical concerns. Her ability to sense lies made her invaluable to customers seeking authentic supernatural texts or trying to verify the claims of various magical practitioners, though she'd never told anyone about this particular talent, not even her grandmother, who seemed to know everything else about her granddaughter's secret heart. The morning passed quietly until around noon, when a tall woman in an expensive coat entered, her movements too fluid and graceful to be entirely human, scanning the shelves with predatory focus before approaching Mia at the counter. "I'm looking for information about old bloodline records," the woman said, her accent carrying hints of something European and ancient. Specifically, records that might contain genealogical information about families who came to America in the late 1800s. Mia's stomach twisted with that familiar warning sensation as she studied the woman's face, noting the too perfect skin and eyes that reflected light like polished amber. "I'm sorry, but we don't keep genealogical records here," Mia replied carefully. "You might try the city archives or the Supernatural Community Center on Pine Street." The woman's smile sharpened. "Of course, how foolish of me to think a simple bookstore would have such specialized materials. But perhaps you know of someone who might be able to help a researcher seeking information about certain inherited traits that might skip generations before manifesting unexpectedly." The lie detector in Mia's chest screamed warnings as the woman's gaze seemed to catalog every detail of her appearance, from her black hair to her dark eyes to the way she unconsciously touched her jacket pocket where her grandmother's ring rested. "I really don't know anything about that," Mia said, which was absolutely true, though she couldn't shake the feeling that this woman was searching for something specific, and Mia herself was somehow connected to that search. The strange visits continued throughout the week, always different people, but always with the same focused interest in bloodlines and family histories, always studying Mia with an intensity that made her skin crawl. By Friday afternoon, the rain had intensified into a proper Pacific Northwest deluge that turned the world into a watercolor painting of grays and blues, and Mia found herself staying later than usual to reorganize the folklore section that had been thoroughly disrupted by the week's unusual customers. When she finally locked up and stepped into the storm, juggling her umbrella, purse, coffee cup, and a stack of books she was taking home for the weekend, her mind was focused on catching the next bus before the weather got any worse. She hurried down the narrow sidewalk with her head down against the driving rain, not paying attention to anything except the warm glow of the bus stop ahead, when something solid and immovable appeared directly in her path. The collision happened in slow motion and real time simultaneously, her coffee cup flying in a perfect arc as she bounced off what felt like a marble statue wrapped in expensive leather, her books scattering across the wet pavement while she flailed for balance and found herself caught by hands that were both gentle and impossibly strong. "I'm so sorry," she gasped, looking up into eyes the color of old gold coins, ancient and unblinking in a face that belonged in a museum sculpture gallery. "Oh God, your jacket, I've ruined it completely," and the words that came out next surprised her as much as they clearly shocked him, because she had never spoken anything but English and Mandarin in her entire life, yet somehow heard herself saying Adrian Vash Keth Naller in a voice that carried harmonics she didn't recognize as her own. The man went absolutely still, his golden eyes widening as something like recognition and impossible hope flickered across his marble-perfect features. The rain continued to fall around them, but seemed to slow, individual droplets catching the streetlight like suspended crystals. And Mia realized that everyone on the busy sidewalk had stopped moving, supernatural and human alike, turning to stare at this moment that felt charged with electricity and ancient power. Without breaking eye contact, the man released her arms and smoothly dropped to one knee on the wet pavement, his expensive leather jacket forgotten as he reached into his coat and withdrew a ring that made her grandmother's gift feel like a child's toy in comparison. This ring was clearly old beyond measure, its black metal carved with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the uncertain light, centered with a stone that held depths like looking into the heart of a dying star. "I accept your petition and offer my eternal protection," he said in a voice that carried the weight of centuries and absolute authority, holding the ring toward her, with the formality of a knight swearing fealty to his queen. The crowd around them had grown larger, phones emerging to capture this incomprehensible scene, and Mia saw vampires actually bowing their heads, while werewolves stepped back with expressions of profound respect, the Fey watchers going completely motionless in the way of their people when witnessing something that might rewrite the rules they thought they understood. "What just happened?" Mia whispered, staring down at this impossibly beautiful man, kneeling in the rain before her, like something out of the fairy tales her family insisted were foolish dreams, his golden eyes holding promises and dangers she couldn't even begin to comprehend. Before Mia could fully process what had happened, or demand answers from the golden-eyed man still kneeling before her in the rain, a sleek black car materialized at the curb as if it had been waiting in the shadows for precisely this moment. The passenger door opened with mechanical precision, and a woman emerged who moved with the predatory grace of a large cat, her dark hair pulled back in a severe chignon that emphasized the aristocratic angles of her face and the way her coat fit like it had been tailored by someone who understood both fashion and the need for concealed weapons. Elena Vasquez had been beautiful in life, and death had only refined that beauty into something sharp and dangerous. Her brown eyes holding depths that spoke of centuries spent navigating court intrigue and supernatural politics, while her accent carried the musical cadences of old Castilian Spanish, mixed with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Miss Chen," she said, her voice cutting through the rain and the murmur of the growing crowd with surgical precision, "I am Elena Vasquez, second of the Pacific Northwest Court, and I must insist that you come with us immediately for your own protection and the protection of everyone present. The ancient words you spoke have invoked laws older than this city, older than this country, and the magic that binds you now to our king cannot be undone by ignorance or good intentions." Mia stepped backward, clutching the scattered books she had managed to retrieve, while Adrian remained motionless on one knee, the ring still extended toward her like an offering that would change everything the moment she touched it. "I don't understand any of this," Mia said, her voice rising with panic as she looked around at the faces watching her with mixtures of awe, fear, and calculation. "I was just apologizing for spilling coffee on his jacket. I don't know where those words came from or what they mean, and I certainly didn't ask anyone to kneel in the rain or offer me jewelry that probably costs more than I make in a year." Elena's expression softened slightly, though her posture remained alert as she scanned the crowd for potential threats while keeping one eye on Adrian, who had not moved so much as a muscle since dropping to his knee in what was clearly a formal ritual position. "The words you spoke were Adrian Vash Keth Nalar, which in the old tongue means honored one who stands alone. I petition for your protection," Elena explained with the patience of someone who had spent decades teaching younger vampires the intricacies of their laws and customs. "This is Keth Nalar, an ancient binding that allows mortals to formally recognize a vampire king's sovereignty and request his guardianship. And the magic does not distinguish between intentional invocation and accidental utterance, because the very act of speaking those words in that language requires a connection to power that most humans do not possess. The rain continued to fall but seemed lighter now, as if even the weather was holding its breath, while Elena continued her explanation with the crisp efficiency of someone delivering a legal briefing that could not be interrupted or questioned until she finished laying out all the relevant facts. Once invoked, Keth Nelar creates a binding relationship between the petitioner and the vampire king that cannot be broken except by death or formal release. And during the time of this binding, you are under his absolute protection, which means no supernatural creature in existence may harm you without facing the full wrath of his court and his personal vengeance. In return, you owe him your loyalty and must accept his guidance in all matters that concern your safety and well-being. And the magic itself will enforce these obligations whether you understand them or not, whether you agreed to them consciously or not, because ancient magic does not care about modern concepts like informed consent or misunderstandings. Adrian finally rose to his feet with fluid grace, the ring disappearing back into his coat as he studied Mia's face with those unsettling golden eyes that seemed to see through her protest to something deeper that she herself didn't understand. "The magic knows what it has bound," he said, his voice carrying an accent that might have been British centuries ago, but had been refined by time into something unique and unplaceable. "You spoke words that no mortal should know in a language that has been dead for 300 years, yet they came from your lips with perfect pronunciation and proper formal structure, which means you are far from ordinary, even if you do not yet understand what you are." Elena gestured toward the waiting car with the kind of polite insistence that made it clear this was not actually a request. "Your safety and the safety of everyone in this district depends on us removing you from public view immediately," she said. As more phones appeared among the crowd, and Mia realized with growing horror that videos of this encounter were already being uploaded to social media platforms where they would spread faster than wildfire through both human and supernatural communities. The Vampire King publicly accepting a petitioner is news that will reach every supernatural court from here to the East Coast within hours. And there are those who will see this as either an opportunity to exploit or a threat to eliminate before it can upset the delicate balance of power that keeps our worlds functioning peacefully together. Mia found herself in the back seat of the car before she could form another coherent protest. Adrian sliding in beside her, while Elena took the front passenger seat and nodded to the driver, who immediately pulled away from the curb with the smooth acceleration of someone who had driven vampires for long enough to know that speed and discretion were equally important. The interior of the car was all black leather and tinted windows that made the outside world look distant and unreal, while some kind of classical music played softly from hidden speakers, and the temperature was precisely controlled to that perfect coolness that made Mia suddenly aware of how much her hands were shaking. As they drove through the city toward hills she had never visited, Elena's voice continued its relentless explanation of the situation Mia had stumbled into without meaning to, describing a world that existed parallel to the one she thought she knew, where ancient laws still held power and words spoken in forgotten languages could bind souls across centuries and species lines. The estate where they were taking her had been Adrian's home for over a century, built on land that had been sacred to local tribes long before European vampires arrived in the Pacific Northwest, and it served as both his private residence and the administrative center for a vampire population that numbered over 12,000 across Washington, Oregon, and parts of Northern California and British Columbia. Elena spoke of vampire politics with the casual expertise of someone who had spent decades navigating councils and courts and territorial disputes, of laws that governed how vampires could feed and where they could establish territories and how they related to the werewolf packs and fae courts that shared the same geographical regions under treaties negotiated after the revelation 20 years ago. The estate itself rose from the Seattle hills like something from a Gothic novel, all dark stone and tall windows that reflected the city lights below while managing to look both ancient and thoroughly modern, as if someone had taken a medieval castle and updated it with contemporary materials and 21st century technology. Adrian led her through a front hall that soared 3 stories above their heads, its walls lined with portraits that showed the same golden eyes in faces that spanned centuries of changing fashion and artistic styles, while Elena explained that vampire courts maintained certain protocols and ceremonies that dated back to their origins in medieval Europe, even as they adapted to modern legal frameworks and democratic principles. The great room where they finally stopped walking was a study in contrasts, with furniture that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread for Architectural Digest arranged around a fireplace large enough to stand in, while screens built into the walls displayed feeds from security cameras and what looked like a real-time map showing the locations of vampires throughout the region as small points of light moving through a digital representation of the Pacific Northwest. "This is where he rules from," Elena said, gesturing toward Adrian, who had moved to stand before the fireplace with his back to them, his silhouette dark against the flames that cast dancing shadows across the stone walls. 12,000 vampires across 4 states and 1 province, each of them bound to him by laws of fealty and protection that are both mystical and contractual. Legal documents filed with supernatural affairs, departments of various governments, and sworn oaths that carry the weight of blood magic and consequences that extend beyond death itself. Mia sank into one of the leather chairs that probably cost more than her annual rent and tried to process the magnitude of what she was being told. That her simple apology for spilling coffee had somehow entangled her in a web of supernatural law and ancient magic that connected her to this beautiful, terrifying man who ruled vampires like some kind of corporate executive crossed with a medieval king. "I didn't ask for any of this," she said, her voice sounding small in the vast room with its soaring ceiling and watching portraits. "I just wanted to go home and read a book and pretend that family dinner never happened. I don't want to be protected or guided or bound to anyone by magic I don't understand, and I certainly don't want to be responsible for disrupting some delicate balance of supernatural politics that I didn't even know existed until 20 minutes ago." Adrian turned from the fireplace then, his golden eyes reflecting the flames as he studied her with an expression that might have been curiosity or hunger or something else entirely that she couldn't identify. "What you want and what you have become are no longer the same thing," he said with the gentle finality of someone delivering a diagnosis that could not be appealed or reversed. "The magic has recognized something in you that drew those words from your lips, something that allowed you to speak a language you claim never to have learned in a manner that invoked one of our oldest and most binding laws. And until we understand what that something is and why it manifested in that particular moment, you are safer here under my direct protection than anywhere else in the world." Elena moved to a side table where she opened a wooden box that looked like it might be an antique jewelry case, removing from it a pendant on a silver chain that seemed to absorb light rather than reflecting it. "This is a protection amulet," she said, approaching Mia with the kind of careful movements used around frightened animals. "It will allow Adrian to sense if you are in danger and summon him to your location regardless of distance or circumstances, and while you wear it, no supernatural creature will be able to harm you directly without triggering consequences that most would find unacceptable." Mia stared at the pendant that Elena held toward her, realizing that accepting it would be another step deeper into this world she had never chosen to enter, yet understanding with growing clarity that she might not have a choice anymore about whether to step back into her old life or forward into whatever this new existence would become. 3 days after accepting the protection amulet that now hung around her neck, like a constant reminder of how thoroughly her life had changed, Mia was attempting to catalog a shipment of rare folklore texts in the bookstore when the door chimes announced a visitor whose presence seemed to drain warmth from the air itself. The man who entered moved with the predatory confidence of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous thing in any room, his silver hair swept back from a face that belonged in a Renaissance painting depicting fallen angels, while his expensive suit did nothing to soften the aura of barely contained violence that preceded him like a storm front. Marcus Blackwood had ruled the vampires of New York and the surrounding territories for nearly 4 centuries, building an empire that blended old-world brutality with modern corporate efficiency, and his reputation for eliminating obstacles with surgical precision had reached even the isolated Pacific Northwest, where Adrian's more collaborative approach to vampire governance had created what Marcus considered a dangerous precedent of weakness. "I come seeking audience with the so-called petitioner who has captured the attention of our Western king," Marcus said, his British accent carrying the crisp authority of someone who had learned English when it was still spoken by actual nobility rather than democracy-addled colonials. "Your reputation has preceded you, Miss Chen, though I confess myself curious about the circumstances that led to such an unprecedented public display of supernatural protocol being invoked by someone who claims complete ignorance of our ways and customs." Mia's hands trembled slightly as she set down the book she had been examining, her protection amulet growing warm against her skin in what she had learned was its way of detecting potential threats, while her ability to sense lies immediately activated like an internal alarm system that screamed warnings about every word this beautiful, terrifying man spoke. "I'm sorry, but the bookstore is closed for inventory," she managed to say, though her voice sounded thin and unconvincing even to her own ears, as Marcus stepped closer with the fluid grace of a predator approaching cornered prey. "Closed, perhaps, but hardly empty, and certainly not private enough for the conversation we must have about the irregularities surrounding your petition to Adrian Drackle," Marcus replied with a smile that revealed fangs as sharp and white as surgical instruments. Before Mia could reach for the panic button Elena had installed beneath the counter, Marcus continued speaking in that cultured voice that made every word sound like a legal argument being presented before a court that had already decided her guilt. "The invocation of Keth Nalar requires certain conditions to be met, primary among them being that the petitioner must be fully human, with no supernatural heritage that might complicate the binding or create conflicting jurisdictional claims. And my research into your family history has revealed some fascinating discrepancies that call into question the validity of Adrian's protection and the binding that has so publicly connected your fates. Your grandmother, Chen Li Mei, was born in Guangzhou in 1943 to a family that local records describe as having unusual luck with their business ventures and an uncanny ability to negotiate favorable terms even in the most disadvantageous circumstances, traits that become more interesting when one discovers that your great-great-grandmother was known locally as someone who could see through deceptions and whose dreams often revealed future events with startling accuracy. Marcus pulled out a leather portfolio that looked like it belonged in a lawyer's office, spreading photographs and documents across the counter with the methodical precision of someone building a case that would be impossible to refute. The Fae have always been more subtle in their breeding practices than vampires or werewolves, preferring to leave their offspring among human populations where their enhanced intuition and natural charisma would be assets rather than obvious supernatural markers. And your family line shows clear evidence of Fae's influence stretching back at least 4 generations, with your grandmother being what we would classify as quarter Fae at minimum, making you an eighth blood with enough supernatural heritage to invalidate any purely human petition for vampire protection. The documents scattered across the counter included birth certificates written in Chinese characters that Mia couldn't read, photographs of women who shared her dark eyes and delicate bone structure, and what appeared to be testimonials from neighbors and business associates describing the Chen family's unusual success in ventures that should have failed, and their reputation for knowing when people were lying or trying to cheat them. The implications hit Mia like physical blows as Marcus continued his relentless presentation, explaining that Fey blood carried magical properties that manifested differently in each generation, but never truly disappeared from a family line, that her ability to sense deception and the way ancient vampire words had tumbled from her lips without conscious knowledge were clear indicators of her supernatural heritage awakening under stress. If you carry Fey blood, even diluted by generations of human breeding, then you fall under Fey jurisdiction rather than human protection laws, which means Adrian's acceptance of your petition was premature at best and potentially fraudulent at worst, Marcus said, with the satisfaction of someone who had found the legal loophole that would unravel his opponent's carefully constructed position. The binding between you becomes void the moment your mixed heritage is officially recognized, and you would be subject to Fey court authority rather than vampire protection, which creates opportunities for renegotiation of territorial boundaries and power structures that have remained static for far too long in this region. Before Mia could fully process the magnitude of what Marcus was suggesting, the air in the bookstore shifted with the sudden presence of Adrian and Elena, both of them moving with the kind of supernatural speed that made them appear to materialize rather than enter through the door, Adrian's golden eyes blazing with fury, while Elena positioned herself between Marcus and Mia with the protective instincts of someone who had spent centuries guarding what mattered to her king. "Marcus Blackwood," Adrian said, his voice carrying undertones that made the windows vibrate slightly and sent every supernatural creature within 6 blocks into high alert. "You overstep your authority by approaching my protected one without permission or escort, and your presence in my territory without formal announcement constitutes a breach of protocol that I am well within my rights to address with extreme prejudice." The confrontation that followed played out like a chess match, where every move carried consequences that could reshape supernatural politics across the continent. Marcus presenting his evidence of Mia's Fey heritage with the methodical precision of a prosecutor, building an airtight case, while Adrian countered with arguments about the primacy of magical recognition over genealogical technicalities, and the binding power of ancient words properly spoken, regardless of the speaker's conscious knowledge of their meaning. Elena documented everything with the efficiency of someone who understood that supernatural law often came down to precise wording and unassailable evidence, while Mia found herself caught between growing panic about the implications of having supernatural blood she had never suspected, and a strange sense of relief that finally explained the abilities she had never understood, and the feeling of never quite fitting into the purely human world her family inhabited. The debate continued for hours, moving from the bookstore to Adrian's estate, where they could access legal texts and precedent cases from supernatural courts across North America and Europe, Marcus arguing that Fey blood automatically invalidated any vampire protection regardless of how it was invoked, while Adrian maintained that the magical binding itself proved that the ancient laws recognized Mia's petition as legitimate regardless of her exact heritage. As they researched through volumes of supernatural law that read like combinations of legal documents and fairy tales, Mia began to understand that her entire life had been shaped by abilities she didn't know she possessed, that her knack for sensing lies and her instinctive understanding of people's true motivations weren't just keen observation skills, but actual magical talents inherited from Fey ancestors who had passed their gifts down through generations of increasingly human descendants. The ring her grandmother had given her grew warm whenever she handled the old texts, as if responding to magical energies that surrounded legal documents written with actual power rather than mere words. And when she touched certain passages about Fey-human hybrid offspring, her vision would blur briefly with images of gardens that existed outside normal time and courts where beauty and danger danced together in eternal, deadly ballet. During a break in their legal research, while Marcus made calls to supernatural courts on the East Coast, seeking precedents that might support his position, Adrian finally explained to Mia the personal history that had shaped his approach to ruling and his fear of forming connections with mortals, whose lives would always be measured in decades rather than centuries. He had been human during the Black Plague, a physician in London who lost his entire family to the disease he couldn't cure, and his transformation into a vampire had been both salvation and curse, granting him the power to save others, but condemning him to watch everyone he cared about age and die while he remained unchanged. 300 years of ruling had taught him to maintain emotional distance from those he protected, to care about his people collectively rather than individually, to make decisions based on duty rather than personal attachment. Yet something about Mia's mixture of vulnerability and strength challenged every defensive wall he had built around his heart. She reminded him of what it felt like to hope for more than mere survival, to imagine a future that included connection rather than just responsibility, and the realization that he was developing feelings for his protected one created complications that went far beyond the legal challenges Marcus had introduced. For her part, Mia found herself sharing the stories that had shaped her own relationship with love and connection, explaining how her family's constant dismissal of her romantic dreams had made her determined to prove that fairy tale endings were possible, even in a world that seemed designed to crush optimism beneath practical concerns. Her belief in true love wasn't naive romanticism, but fierce determination to find something real and lasting in a world where most people settled for convenience or compatibility rather than the kind of soul-deep connection that could survive any challenge. And talking with Adrian about loneliness and hope and the courage required to keep believing in love, despite repeated disappointments, created an intimacy that neither of them had expected or prepared for. The evening of their third day of research brought an interruption that changed everything, as a figure appeared in Adrian's study without bothering with doors or windows or any of the normal methods that even supernatural beings used to enter private spaces. Oberon, Lord of the Pacific Fae Court, materialized like stepping through an invisible doorway from someplace else entirely, his beauty so perfect it was almost painful to look at directly, while his presence filled the room with the scent of wild roses and the sound of distant music that might have been wind chimes or might have been laughter from creatures that had never been human. The Fey Lord wore what appeared to be a simple white shirt and dark pants, but fabric that moved like liquid moonlight, and seemed to shift between expensive modern clothing and ancient robes depending on the angle from which it was viewed, while his hair changed color from gold to silver to auburn with each movement of his head, and his eyes held depths that suggested he was looking at them from across vast distances of time and space. Marcus Blackwood has petitioned our court for recognition of his claims regarding the mixed blood of this young woman, Oberon said, his voice carrying harmonics that made ordinary human speech sound crude and flat by comparison. And while we find his methods distasteful and his motivations transparently political, the questions he raises about jurisdiction and heritage cannot be dismissed without proper consideration. The Fey Court would examine this matter through our own methods, which differ significantly from the legal precedents and documentary evidence that occupy vampire attention, for we care less about bloodlines than about the choices that reveal the true nature of a soul caught between worlds. Elena tensed visibly at this announcement, understanding better than either Adrian or Mia the implications of Fey court involvement. For the Fae operated by rules that made vampire law seem straightforward by comparison, everything built around bargains and word games and tests that revealed truth through choice rather than evidence. Oberon's proposal was elegantly simple and impossibly complex, offering to resolve the question of Mia's heritage and the validity of her vampire protection through a test that would determine whether her human heart or her Fae blood held stronger influence over her essential nature. She would be presented with a choice between perfect love guaranteed through Fae magic, a connection that would never disappoint or diminish or cause pain, but would also never surprise or grow or challenge her to become more than she was, and the uncertain path of mortal affection with all its risks of heartbreak and loss, and the possibility of finding something real enough to justify those dangers. If she chose the magical perfection, she would be acknowledging her Fae heritage and accepting Fae court jurisdiction, voiding Adrian's protection and freeing Marcus to pursue his territorial ambitions. But if she chose uncertainty and risk over guaranteed happiness, she would be proving her human heart dominant and confirming the validity of her vampire protection. Adrian listened to this proposal with growing horror, realizing that he had developed feelings for Mia that went beyond duty or the magical binding between them, feelings that would make watching her choose perfect love with someone else a torture worse than any physical pain he had endured in 3 centuries of existence. The test would take place in neutral territory under Fae court supervision, and Mia would make her choice without influence from vampire politics or protection magic, or anything except her own understanding of what she truly wanted from love and life and the future she hoped to build for herself. The Fae Court's test was scheduled for the following evening, but before dawn could break over Seattle's rain-soaked streets, the carefully orchestrated world of supernatural politics exploded into violence that transformed Between the Lines bookstore into a battlefield. Mia had returned to work despite Elena's protests, needing the familiar comfort of books and routine, while she wrestled with the impossible choice Oberon had presented, unaware that her presence in the bookstore had been carefully tracked by a coalition of extremists who saw her very existence as a symbol of everything wrong with modern supernatural society. The Purist Alliance, as they called themselves, consisted of vampires who longed for the days when they were feared rather than regulated, werewolves who resented having to register their pack movements with city authorities, and human hunters who believed the revelation had been a mistake that needed to be violently corrected through strategic elimination of high-profile supernatural human connections. They had been planning this attack for weeks, studying Mia's routines and Adrian's protection protocols, waiting for the moment when striking at her would send the clearest possible message that love between species was an abomination that threatened the natural order they sought to restore. The assault began at dusk, when the supernatural district was transitioning from its daytime human-friendly businesses to the nighttime establishments that catered more exclusively to non-human clientele, a time when foot traffic was heavy enough to ensure maximum witnesses, but scattered enough to create confusion that would delay any organized response to the violence they planned to unleash. The first sign of trouble was the way the streetlights began flickering in a pattern that Adrian's security teams would later recognize as a coordinated signal, followed by the gradual evacuation of supernatural customers from neighboring businesses as those with enhanced senses detected the approaching threat, while human patrons remained obliviously focused on their shopping and conversations. Mia was shelving returns in the folklore section when her protection amulet began warming against her skin, the sensation building from gentle warmth to actual heat that made her pause in her work and look around the store with growing unease. The 3 customers browsing the mythology texts moved with too much coordination, their casual examination of book covers belied by the way they positioned themselves to control the store's exit routes, while the woman reading romance novels near the front window kept glancing at her watch as if waiting for a predetermined signal to begin whatever they had planned. When Mia's lie detection ability activated without conscious prompting, flooding her mind with warnings that every casual smile and polite nod around her concealed deadly intentions, she finally understood that the warming amulet wasn't responding to potential danger, but to immediate, coordinated threat that was already inside her supposedly safe space. The attack itself unfolded with the brutal efficiency of military precision, the 3 customers revealing weapons that had been concealed by glamour magic, while the romance reader barricaded the front door with supernatural strength that bent the metal frame like putty. These weren't random extremists acting on impulse, but trained operatives who had studied vampire protection protocols and planned countermeasures for every defensive strategy Adrian's people might employ, including jamming frequencies that prevented Mia's amulet from sending its distress signal, while magical wards blocked the store from supernatural senses that might otherwise detect the violence taking place inside. The vampire among them moved with predatory grace as he explained their mission in the cultured tones of someone delivering a lecture rather than a death sentence, describing how her relationship with Adrian represented everything wrong with the modern world's attempt to integrate species that were never meant to coexist as equals. They spoke of purity and natural order and the necessity of maintaining boundaries that had existed for millennia before foolish modern ideas about equality and integration had corrupted the fundamental relationships between predator and prey, supernatural and human, those who ruled through power and those who existed at their sufferance. The werewolf in the group shifted into a form halfway between human and wolf, her enhanced strength allowing her to tear through the store's defenses like tissue paper, while her pack-hunting instincts coordinated perfectly with her partner's supernatural abilities to create an inescapable trap. They had studied Mia's abilities as well as Adrian's, knowing about her lie detection, but not understanding that her Fey heritage included other talents, that stress and mortal terror were beginning to awaken, powers that had been dormant in her bloodline for generations, but were now responding to immediate threat with instincts older than human civilization. The human hunter among them carried weapons designed specifically for supernatural targets, blessed silver and cold iron and bullets carved with symbols that would disrupt magical healing. His fanatical belief in human superiority, making him the most dangerous member of a team that included creatures far stronger and faster than any mortal had a right to face and survive. As they closed in on her with speeches about sacrifice for the greater good and the necessity of sending clear messages to those who would corrupt the natural order, Mia felt something stirring in her blood that was neither entirely human nor completely fey, but something new and unexpected that responded to their threats with power she had never imagined possessing. The protection amulet finally broke through their jamming frequencies just as the vampire reached for her throat, its distress signal exploding across the supernatural networks of Seattle like a psychic scream that shattered windows 3 blocks away and sent every vampire in Adrian's territory into immediate combat readiness. Adrian himself materialized in the bookstore before the amulet's echo had finished reverberating, moving with speed that made his previous demonstrations of supernatural ability look like casual strolls. And for the first time in decades of careful, controlled rulership, he fought not as a king fulfilling his obligations to a protected subject, but as a man defending the woman he loved from those who would destroy her to make a political point. The battle that followed was less a fight than a natural disaster, Adrian's power unleashed by genuine emotion proving devastating beyond anything the extremists had prepared for. His fury at seeing Mia threatened, transforming him into the kind of apex predator that had made vampires legends of terror in the centuries before they revealed themselves to modern humanity. The vampire extremist lasted perhaps 30 seconds against Adrian's rage, his carefully planned attack strategies useless against raw power that could tear through magical defenses like they were spider webs, while the werewolf found her enhanced strength meaningless when facing someone whose supernatural abilities had been honed by 3 centuries of combat experience and were now amplified by protective instincts that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with love. The human hunter's blessed weapons proved equally ineffective against Adrian's transformed state, the ancient magic that bound him to his vampiric nature now reinforced by something even older and more primal, the soul-deep need to protect what mattered most, overriding every tactical consideration and safety protocol that normally governed his use of power. When the violence finally ended, the bookstore looked like it had been hit by a supernatural hurricane. Shelves destroyed and books scattered like fallen leaves, while scorch marks on the walls showed where magical energies had discharged with enough force to melt metal and crack stone. Mia stood in the center of this destruction unharmed but fundamentally changed, her Fey heritage now fully awakened by the trauma and manifesting in ways that made the air around her shimmer with power that was neither entirely magical nor completely mortal, but something unique that bridged the gap between worlds. Adrian knelt beside her, as Elena and the emergency response team secured the scene, his hands shaking as he checked for injuries, while his golden eyes blazed with emotions he had spent centuries learning to suppress and could no longer contain or disguise. In the aftermath of the attack, as supernatural investigators documented the scene and Elena coordinated with city authorities to manage the human witnesses and media coverage, Adrian finally spoke the words that changed everything between them, with a honesty that made his previous careful diplomacy seem like elaborate pretense. "The binding between us has evolved beyond the protection pact you accidentally invoked," he said, his voice rough with emotions that had been building since that first moment in the rain outside this very bookstore. "What began as ancient law has become something deeper, a soul bond that happens only once in a vampire's existence, and only when genuine love transforms duty into something that transcends political necessity or magical obligation. The magic recognizes what I have been trying to deny to myself and to you, that protecting you is no longer about fulfilling my responsibilities as king, but about safeguarding the person who has become essential to my existence in ways that have nothing to do with law or tradition or the careful balance of supernatural politics." Mia listened to his confession with growing understanding that the warmth she felt when he was near, and the way her heart raced when he looked at her with those ancient golden eyes, weren't just gratitude for his protection or fascination with his otherworldly nature, but the beginning of love that was as unexpected as it was undeniable. The soul bond Adrian described was different from the protection pact that had brought them together. A magical connection that would tie their lives together across centuries and eventually offer her the choice of immortality if she wanted to share his endless existence. But accepting such a bond meant abandoning any possibility of returning to her previous life or the simple human future her family expected her to pursue. Elena explained the implications with clinical precision while Adrian waited for her response, describing how soul bonds worked in vampire culture and the responsibilities and privileges that came with such connections, the way they would share emotions and be able to sense each other's well-being across any distance, how their magical abilities would strengthen when they were together and weaken when they were apart. The choice was entirely hers to make, but once made could never be undone, the bond becoming part of their essential natures and surviving even death in some form, connecting them across whatever existence waited beyond mortal life and vampire immortality. As Mia struggled with the magnitude of this decision and what it would mean for her dreams of finding love that was both magical and real, Elena's phone rang with news that would complicate everything they thought they understood about their situation and Adrian's position in the supernatural hierarchy. The Vampire Council had called an emergency session to address what they termed Adrian's compromised judgment and emotional instability. Citing his public display of uncontrolled power during the bookstore attack and his obvious personal attachment to his protected subject as evidence that he was no longer fit to rule over 12,000 vampires whose security depended on leadership that prioritized collective good over individual desires. The formal hearing would take place within 48 hours, giving Adrian barely enough time to prepare a defense against charges that could result in his removal from power and exile from the territory he had spent over a century building into a model of supernatural human cooperation. Elena's voice carried barely controlled fury as she relayed the council's demands and the political maneuvering that had made this challenge possible. Marcus Blackwood's influence with certain council members having created an opportunity to remove Adrian and install a more traditionally minded vampire lord who would return to the old ways of ruling through fear rather than collaboration. The timing was clearly deliberate, forcing Adrian to choose between defending his crown and protecting Mia during the Fey court test that would determine her heritage and the validity of their bond, a calculated assault on multiple fronts that would eliminate him regardless of which obligation he chose to prioritize. Standing in the ruins of her bookstore with Adrian's confession still echoing in her ears and the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her shoulders, Mia realized that her accidental petition for vampire protection had started a chain of events that would reshape not just her own life, but the entire balance of supernatural power in the Pacific Northwest, and that the love she had always dreamed of finding came with responsibilities and dangers she had never imagined in her most elaborate romantic fantasies. The Vampire Council convened in the ancient chambers beneath Adrian's estate, a space that predated the modern mansion above by several centuries and still bore the carved symbols of bloodlines that had ruled in Europe before the great migrations to the New World brought supernatural politics across the Atlantic. 6 figures sat in chairs that resembled thrones, each one representing a different vampire lineage that stretched back to the origins of their species, their combined age measured in millennia, and their collective power capable of reshaping the supernatural landscape of an entire continent with a single unanimous decision. Councillor Vasiliev spoke for the Russian bloodlines that had survived czars and commissars and nuclear winters, her pale eyes holding the coldness of Siberian steppes, while her voice carried the authority of someone who had outlived entire civilizations and watched empires rise and fall like seasons changing across the endless expanse of time. Councillor Montenegro represented the Mediterranean vampires whose territories included some of the oldest vampire courts in existence, his olive skin and dark hair concealing an age that made him contemporary with Roman emperors and Byzantine scholars. While his political instincts had been honed by centuries of navigating the complex relationships between vampire courts and human kingdoms that shared the same geographical boundaries. The other council members carried equally impressive credentials, each one a survivor of their bloodline's most dangerous periods, and a master of the kind of long-term strategic thinking that came from measuring consequences across decades rather than years, and their presence in Adrian's domain represented both an honor and a threat that could eliminate everything he had built in the Pacific Northwest. Adrian entered the chamber, wearing the formal court attire that tradition demanded for such proceedings. Black silk and silver threads that caught the light from torches designed to burn without consuming oxygen in underground spaces where breathing was optional, but atmosphere remained important for psychological effect. Elena accompanied him as his second and advocate, her own formal dress a deep burgundy that complemented the ancient Spanish court protocols she had learned in life and refined through 2 centuries of vampire politics, while Mia walked beside them wearing a simple black dress that somehow made her Fey heritage more visible, as if the formal setting had awakened magical aspects of her nature that casual clothes had concealed or minimized. The council members studied her with the focused attention of predators evaluating potential prey, though their interest was political rather than gustatory, each of them calculating how her presence might affect the balance of power they had spent lifetimes establishing and maintaining across the supernatural communities of North America. Marcus Blackwood sat in the observer section with the satisfied expression of someone whose carefully orchestrated plan was unfolding exactly as he had intended. His confidence based on intelligence networks that had given him detailed information about each council member's political preferences and personal grudges against Adrian's collaborative approach to vampire governance. Councillor Vasiliev opened the proceedings with the formal protocols that governed vampire justice, her voice echoing in the stone chamber as she recited charges that had been refined through centuries of similar hearings where vampire lords were called to account for actions that threatened the stability or security of their communities. Adrian Drackle stands accused of compromised judgment, emotional instability, and prioritizing personal desires over the welfare of his subjects, she announced, her accent making each word sound like a judicial pronouncement that could not be appealed or reversed through any lesser authority. The evidence presented includes his public display of uncontrolled power during the recent attack on his protected subject, his obvious emotional attachment to a half-Fey individual whose heritage creates jurisdictional complications, and his repeated demonstration of decision-making processes that favor personal relationships over political necessity and collective security. The formal language masked what everyone in the chamber understood to be a fundamental challenge to the type of leadership Adrian represented, a test of whether vampire society would continue evolving toward integration with the modern world, or retreat into the isolation and authoritarian control that had characterized their rule for most of recorded history. Each council member presented their concerns with the methodical precision of prosecutors building a case that would justify removing Adrian from power. Their arguments based on political theory and historical precedent, rather than personal animosity or territorial ambition. Councillor Montenegro argued that Adrian's emotional involvement with Mia compromised his ability to make difficult decisions that might require sacrificing individuals for the greater good of the vampire community, citing examples from European vampire courts, where rulers who allowed personal feelings to influence policy had led their subjects into wars that decimated entire bloodlines or exposed them to human persecution that took centuries to overcome. Councillor Ashworth, representing the English bloodlines that had survived everything from Viking raids to German bombing campaigns, questioned whether Adrian's collaborative approach to governance was sustainable in a world where other supernatural communities were becoming increasingly aggressive about territorial claims and resource allocation, arguing that weakness in leadership inevitably led to external challenges that could destroy everything they had built in the New World. The other council members raised similar concerns, each one framing their objections in terms of duty and responsibility and the harsh realities of supernatural politics that required leaders to remain emotionally distant from those they ruled in order to make decisions that served long-term survival rather than short-term happiness or personal fulfillment. When the council finished presenting their case against Adrian's continued rule, Elena stood to offer his defense with the controlled fury of someone who had spent centuries watching capable leaders destroyed by political maneuvering disguised as concern for the greater good. She spoke eloquently about Adrian's achievements as king, the way his territory had become a model for supernatural human cooperation that other regions studied and attempted to emulate, the unprecedented stability and prosperity that his subjects enjoyed under leadership that valued innovation and adaptation over rigid adherence to traditions that had been created in very different historical circumstances. Elena's arguments were supported by detailed statistics about crime rates and economic indicators and integration successes that painted a picture of vampire society thriving under Adrian's rule, rather than suffering from his supposedly compromised judgment, while her personal testimony about his character and decision-making abilities carried the weight of someone who had witnessed his leadership through multiple crises and could speak authoritatively about his fitness for continued rule. But the most powerful moment of the defense came when Mia herself was granted permission to address the council, her request to speak causing surprised murmurs among the observers who had never seen a mortal allowed to participate in vampire judicial proceedings at such a high level. Mia's speech began quietly, her voice carrying the nervous energy of someone who understood that her words could determine not just Adrian's fate, but the direction of supernatural society for generations to come. She spoke about love not as weakness, but as the strongest force in existence, capable of motivating sacrifice and courage and wisdom that purely logical decision-making could never achieve. Arguing that leaders who understood love were better equipped to protect their people because they comprehended what was truly worth defending against external threats and internal decay. Her words gained strength and confidence as she continued, drawing on her lifetime of reading about heroes and leaders and the qualities that separated those who served their people from those who simply controlled them, explaining that Adrian's emotional investment in her welfare hadn't made him weak, but had revealed the depth of his commitment to protecting all of his subjects with the same fierce dedication. The younger vampires in attendance listened with growing excitement to ideas that challenged everything they had been taught about leadership and power. While even some of the council members showed signs of being affected by arguments that reframed emotional attachment as strength rather than liability. Elena's revelation about her covert political activities transformed the entire dynamic of the hearing, as she presented evidence that a significant portion of Adrian's vampire subjects supported his approach to governance and wanted leaders who understood both duty and heart rather than cold calculation and traditional authority. She had been quietly building a coalition among younger vampires who had grown up during the integration period and saw Adrian's collaborative style as the future of supernatural society, gathering signatures and testimonials and political commitments that demonstrated broad support for his continued rule, despite the council's concerns about his emotional compromises. The documents Elena presented showed that vampire society was evolving faster than its leadership structures, with younger generations preferring leaders who could navigate the complex relationships between supernatural and human communities, rather than rulers who maintained power through intimidation and isolation from those they governed. Marcus Blackwood's expression shifted from confidence to concern as Elena's evidence undermined his assumption that vampire society was ready to return to more traditional forms of authoritarian leadership, while the council members found themselves confronting the possibility that their own political positions might be less secure than they had believed. The council's deliberations stretched through the night as the 6 ancient vampires debated among themselves with the kind of careful analysis that came from centuries of political experience and the understanding that their decision would establish precedents that could shape supernatural society for decades or centuries to come. Counselor Vasiliev and Counselor Ashworth remained firmly convinced that Adrian's emotional attachment represented an unacceptable vulnerability that could be exploited by enemies seeking to destabilize vampire society, while Counselor Montenegro and 2 others argued that Elena's evidence of popular support demonstrated that vampire society was evolving and required leadership that could adapt to new realities rather than clinging to traditional approaches that might no longer be effective. The debate revealed fundamental disagreements about the direction vampire society should take in the modern world, whether integration with human communities was a necessary adaptation or a dangerous compromise that would eventually lead to their destruction or assimilation into mortal society. When the final vote was called, the result was a 3-3 split that left the decision in Adrian's own hands, according to ancient protocols that required the accused ruler to choose his own fate when the council could not reach consensus about his fitness for continued leadership. Adrian's choice came without hesitation, his voice steady and clear as he formally abdicated his throne in favor of Elena, explaining that his love for Mia had taught him the difference between ruling through duty alone and leading through understanding of what made life worth protecting and preserving for future generations. He spoke of his centuries of loneliness and the way meeting Mia had awakened parts of his heart that he had thought permanently sealed away by loss and responsibility, arguing that a king who could not understand love could not truly understand his people or the sacrifices they made for the relationships and communities that gave their existence meaning beyond mere survival. The abdication ceremony was simple but binding, Adrian removing the ancient signet ring that symbolized his authority and placing it on Elena's finger, while speaking the formal words that transferred power from one ruler to another, according to traditions that predated most human civilizations and carried the weight of magical law as well as political custom. Elena accepted the responsibility with grace and determination, her acceptance speech promising to continue Adrian's policies while adapting to the changing needs of vampire society and the challenges posed by those who preferred the old ways of secretive isolation and authoritarian control. The unexpected consequences of Adrian's abdication became apparent within hours of the ceremony's completion, as ancient magic woven into the very foundations of vampire kingship began draining his supernatural abilities in accordance with laws that had been established to prevent rulers from abandoning their responsibilities without facing significant personal cost. A vampire king who willingly surrendered power for love was required to prove the strength of his choice by surviving one full lunar cycle as a mortal, stripped of the enhanced strength and speed and healing abilities that had defined his existence for 3 centuries, vulnerable to injury and death in ways that he had not experienced since his original transformation during the Black Plague. Elena explained these consequences with growing alarm as she realized that Adrian's noble gesture had created a new crisis. His vulnerability during the testing period, making him a target for every enemy who had been deterred by his supernatural power and political authority. Marcus Blackwood's reaction to news of Adrian's weakened state was swift and predictable. His forces beginning to move toward the Pacific Northwest, with the clear intention of claiming territory that he now viewed as effectively undefended, despite Elena's formal succession to power. Mia found herself thrust into the role of protector for the man who had risked everything to be with her, her fey abilities growing stronger each day as the magical heritage she had never known awakened in response to the necessity of keeping Adrian safe during his most vulnerable period. She discovered powers of illusion and compulsion that allowed her to hide his presence from supernatural senses, while her ability to sense truth and deception proved invaluable in identifying threats disguised as allies or neutral parties seeking to exploit the instability created by Adrian's abdication and transformation. The allies they had gathered during their previous crises rallied to support them during this testing period, werewolf packs and fey courts, and even some human authorities working together to create a protective network that could compensate for Adrian's lost supernatural abilities, while Elena established her authority as the new vampire queen and prepared to face the challenges that Marcus Blackwood's territorial ambitions would inevitably create. As Adrian's powers continued to fade and his mortality became more pronounced each day, Mia understood that her dreams of finding true love had led her into a world where fairy tale endings required the kind of courage and sacrifice that romance novels rarely explored in their detailed descriptions of passion and devotion and happily ever after. Marcus Blackwood arrived in Seattle with the predatory confidence of a conqueror, claiming territory that he considered already won, his entourage of East Coast vampires moving through the city like a dark tide that left whispers and fearful glances in their wake, as supernatural residents recognized the kind of old-world authority that measured power in blood, spilled rather than communities protected. His army numbered nearly 200 vampires from New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, each one chosen for their loyalty to traditional vampire hierarchy and their skill in the kind of warfare that had kept their species hidden and feared for millennia before the revelation forced them into the uncomfortable spotlight of public scrutiny and legal regulation. Elena met them at the airport with a formal delegation that included werewolf pack leaders and Fey court representatives. Her newly assumed authority as vampire queen, lending weight to protocols that demanded visiting supernatural dignitaries, announced their intentions through proper diplomatic channels, rather than simply appearing with armed forces and territorial demands. The confrontation that followed played out in the sterile environment of a conference room at the Supernatural Community Center, where Marcus laid out his claims with the methodical precision of a lawyer presenting an airtight case to a jury that had already been bribed to deliver the verdict he wanted. Adrian's abdication makes this territory unclaimed under ancient law, Marcus announced, his silver hair catching the fluorescent lights as he studied the assembled representatives with the dismissive contempt of someone who viewed democratic processes as amusing but ultimately irrelevant to the exercise of real power. Elena Vasquez may have accepted his ring and spoken the traditional words, but she lacks the magical authority that comes from centuries of rule and the respect that stems from demonstrated ability to hold territory against all challenges. The Pacific Northwest vampire population requires leadership that understands the harsh realities of supernatural politics, not collaborative idealism that mistakes weakness for wisdom and compromise for strength. His demands were as blunt as his assessment of Elena's fitness to rule, requiring her immediate abdication in his favor and the surrender of Mia as compensation for the disruption her accidental petition had caused to the established order of supernatural society across the continent. Marcus spoke of precedent and tradition, and the necessity of maintaining stability through strong leadership that did not allow personal emotions to compromise decisions affecting thousands of vampires whose survival depended on rulers who understood that sentiment was a luxury their species could not afford in a world full of potential enemies. The supernatural community's response to Marcus's ultimatum revealed the depth of loyalty that Adrian's 3 centuries of fair rule had built among groups that had no obligation to involve themselves in vampire politics, but chose to stand together against threats to the collaborative society they had helped create. Werewolf pack leaders who had negotiated territorial agreements with Adrian, rather than fighting bloody wars, spoke of their respect for a vampire king who honored his commitments and understood that strength came from building alliances rather than conquering enemies, while Fae court representatives acknowledged debts of honor that bound them to defend those who had shown their people respect and consideration in dealings that could have been dictated through superior force. Even human authorities who had worked with Adrian to integrate supernatural residents into the broader community offered their support. Police chiefs and mayors and federal agents who had learned to trust vampire justice and appreciated leadership that valued cooperation over the kind of authoritarian control that Marcus's reputation suggested he would impose if allowed to claim the territory he demanded. Elena coordinated these diverse allies with the skill of someone who had spent centuries learning to build consensus among groups with conflicting interests and competing agendas, her diplomatic experience proving invaluable as she transformed what could have been a chaotic resistance into a unified front capable of challenging Marcus's assumptions about the ease of his conquest. Mia's role in this alliance building surprised everyone, including herself, as the pressure of defending Adrian and the community they had built together awakened Fae abilities that had been dormant in her bloodline for generations, but now manifested with the power and precision of someone whose magical heritage traced back to the original courts that had negotiated the first treaties between supernatural species. Her ability to compel truth became so refined that she could detect not just lies, but the motivations behind them, allowing her to identify Marcus's supporters who had infiltrated the local supernatural community as spies and saboteurs, while revealing the genuine concerns of those who questioned whether Elena's rule would be strong enough to protect them from external threats. The protective barriers she learned to create drew on Fae magic that bent space and time in subtle ways, making buildings and people harder to find and attack, while maintaining the illusion of normal accessibility to those with legitimate business in the areas she warded. Her growing power attracted the attention of ancient Fae nobles who had ignored mortal affairs for centuries, their recognition of her abilities lending credibility to the resistance against Marcus's territorial claims while providing access to magical resources that could level the playing field between his vampire army and the diverse but smaller coalition that had rallied to defend Adrian's legacy. The strategic decision to challenge Marcus through ancient supernatural law rather than direct military confrontation came from Oberon himself, the Fae Lord appearing in Elena's war council with the dramatic flair that his people brought to every significant intervention in mortal or supernatural affairs. Combat between vampire lords follows ancient protocols that predate your modern courts and integration treaties, he explained, his otherworldly beauty making even the experienced supernatural politicians in the room seem crude and mundane by comparison. Marcus has claimed territory through right of conquest, but that claim can be challenged through individual combat, where the stakes are agreed upon by both parties and witnessed by representatives of all supernatural courts with interests in the outcome. If Elena, as the sitting ruler, chooses a champion to fight in her place, victory would establish her legitimacy beyond any further challenge, while defeat would require her abdication and surrender of the territory Marcus seeks to claim. The proposal offered a way to resolve the crisis without the kind of widespread violence that would draw human government attention and potentially trigger a backlash against supernatural integration. but it also meant placing everything they had built on the outcome of a single fight between champions whose abilities and experience differed dramatically. Elena's choice of Mia as her champion shocked even those who had witnessed the awakening of her Fey heritage. But the decision proved strategically sound when the formal terms of the duel were negotiated according to laws that governed combat between different supernatural species. Ancient Fey vampire combat protocols allowed champions to use any abilities inherent to their nature, which meant Mia's truth-compelling magic and protective barriers were as legitimate as Marcus's centuries of fighting experience and supernatural strength, while the presence of representatives from every major supernatural court ensured that the outcome would be recognized across the continent, regardless of which political faction preferred a different result. Adrian's role as advisor and coach during Mia's preparation for the duel revealed depths to his strategic thinking that centuries of diplomatic leadership had concealed. His knowledge of vampire combat techniques proving invaluable, even as his own physical abilities continued to fade toward fully mortal limitations that made him vulnerable to any attack that penetrated the magical protections Mia wove around their temporary stronghold. The duel itself took place in the neutral territory of Discovery Park after sunset, on a night when the moon was dark, and the city lights created an artificial aurora against the low-hanging clouds that seemed to gather specifically to witness this confrontation between Old World authority and New World collaboration. Marcus entered the designated combat zone with the fluid confidence of someone who had survived dozens of similar challenges over 4 centuries of vampire politics, his expensive suit replaced by practical fighting gear that accommodated the kind of supernatural speed and strength that had made him legendary among East Coast vampire courts for his ability to eliminate obstacles through personal violence when political maneuvering proved insufficient. Mia faced him wearing simple clothes that allowed free movement and carrying only the protection amulet that Adrian had given her weeks ago when their relationship was still defined by ancient law, rather than the love that had grown between them through shared dangers and mutual understanding of what they were willing to sacrifice for each other and the communities they had chosen to protect. The opening moments of the fight revealed the vast difference in their combat experience, as Marcus moved with predatory grace that spoke of centuries spent perfecting techniques designed to kill other supernatural beings quickly and efficiently. His attacks came from multiple angles simultaneously, vampire speed allowing him to strike and withdraw faster than normal vision could track, while his tactical awareness let him anticipate and counter the defensive barriers that Mia created instinctively in response to his relentless assault. But her Fey heritage provided advantages that his experience had not prepared him to face. Her ability to see through deceptions revealing the patterns behind his seemingly random attacks, while her truth-sensing magic let her anticipate his intentions before he fully formed them in his conscious mind. Adrian's coaching from the sidelines proved crucial during these early exchanges. His deep knowledge of vampire fighting styles, allowing him to identify weaknesses in Marcus's technique that Mia could exploit, despite her inexperience with supernatural combat, and the overwhelming physical disadvantage that made direct confrontation a losing proposition. The turning point came when Marcus began to gain the upper hand through sheer experience and supernatural strength, his attacks becoming more precise and devastating as he adapted to Mia's defensive strategies and found ways to penetrate her magical barriers through techniques that had been developed specifically for fighting Fey opponents during the ancient wars that had shaped supernatural society in Europe centuries before the New World offered fresh territories where different species could coexist rather than compete for dominance. As Mia felt her defenses weakening and realized that raw power would not be sufficient to defeat an opponent with Marcus's skills and experience, she understood that the true nature of this conflict was not about physical combat, but about proving which approach to leadership would better serve supernatural society in the modern world. Instead of continuing to match force against force in a battle she could not win through conventional means, she shifted her strategy, to use the one advantage her Fey heritage provided that vampire strength could not overcome: the ability to compel absolute truth from anyone within her sphere of influence, regardless of their supernatural nature or political position. The moment when Mia activated her truth-compelling magic with full power, rather than the subtle influence she had been using defensively, transformed the entire dynamic of the duel. As Marcus found himself unable to maintain the careful facades and diplomatic language that had hidden his true motivations throughout his campaign to claim the Pacific Northwest territory. Under the inexorable pressure of Fey magic that made deception impossible, he admitted that his rule was based on intimidation and control rather than genuine care for his subjects, that he viewed vampires under his authority as resources to be exploited rather than people to be protected, that his vision for supernatural society involved returning to the old ways of hidden influence and predatory relationships with human communities, rather than the collaborative integration that Adrian had spent decades building. The supernatural representatives witnessing the duel heard these admissions with growing horror, as Marcus described his plans to eliminate the democratic elements Elena had inherited from Adrian's administration, to end the cooperative agreements with werewolf packs and Fey courts that had created unprecedented stability in the region, to return to traditional vampire practices that prioritized fear and dominance over the mutual respect and legal frameworks that had allowed different species to share territory peacefully. The contrast between Marcus's revealed motivations and Adrian's approach to leadership became undeniable as Mia's magic continued to strip away pretense and political calculation, forcing Marcus to acknowledge that Adrian's decision to abdicate for love had demonstrated the kind of courage that traditional vampire society discouraged in its rulers. While Marcus had spent centuries accumulating power for its own sake and maintaining control through techniques designed to prevent emotional connections that might compromise his willingness to sacrifice individuals for strategic advantage, Adrian had built a kingdom based on understanding what made life worth protecting and defending for those who placed their trust in his leadership. The supernatural community representatives witnessed this fundamental difference between fear-based and love-based authority, with growing recognition that their own security and prosperity depended on leaders who understood the difference between ruling through intimidation and governing through genuine care for their subjects' welfare and happiness. Marcus's defeat came not through physical destruction, but through the complete exposure of his political philosophy to supernatural courts that had evolved beyond the medieval attitudes he represented, his claims to territory and authority collapsing when the witnesses to his compelled admissions rejected both his vision for vampire society and his fitness to rule over communities that had thrived under very different leadership principles. The formal recognition of Elena's legitimacy as vampire queen and Mia's victory as her champion established precedents that would influence supernatural law across North America for generations to come, proving that integration and collaboration were not signs of weakness, but foundations for the kind of strength that could survive challenges from those who preferred the old ways of isolation and authoritarian control that had characterized supernatural society before the revelation forced them to adapt to modern realities and democratic expectations. The ancient magic that had bound Adrian to his vampire nature for 3 centuries began to shift and transform in the days following Marcus's defeat. Responding to choices made and love proven with the kind of fundamental change that occurred perhaps once in a millennium when the universe itself recognized that existing rules required revision to accommodate new possibilities. Elena described the phenomenon with wonder in her voice as she consulted texts that had been written by vampire scholars who had witnessed similar transformations in the distant past, explaining that the magic which governed their species was not static law, but living force that evolved when confronted with actions that transcended its original parameters and expectations. Adrian's willingness to sacrifice power for love had created what the ancient texts called a crucible moment, when supernatural magic acknowledged that its existing structures were insufficient to contain the reality of what had been chosen and achieved, opening pathways to new forms of existence that bridged gaps between species and worlds that had previously been considered unbridgeable by anything except death or fundamental transformation that destroyed the original nature entirely. The choice offered to Adrian by the awakening magic was both simple and profound, presented to him in dreams that felt more real than waking consciousness, as he stood in a space that existed between mortal and supernatural realms, facing manifestations of the fundamental forces that governed vampire existence and fey heritage, and the human capacity for love that transcended biological limitations. He could return to his full vampire nature with all the power and immortality that had defined his existence for centuries, reclaiming the strength and abilities that had made him capable of ruling thousands of supernatural beings while maintaining the emotional connections that his love for Mia had awakened. Or he could choose to become something entirely new that had never existed before in the history of supernatural evolution. The second path would transform him into what the magic called a daywalker, retaining many vampire abilities while gaining the capacity to exist fully in both supernatural and human worlds without the limitations that had traditionally separated the two realms, making him uniquely qualified to serve as a bridge between communities that were still learning to coexist despite centuries of mistrust and fundamental differences in their approaches to existence and mortality. Adrian's decision came without hesitation, as he considered not just his own desires, but the needs of the changing world around him, recognizing that his love for Mia had taught him lessons about leadership and sacrifice that went far beyond the traditional responsibilities of vampire royalty or the simple pursuit of personal happiness. The choice to become a daywalker represented a commitment to serving something larger than himself, or even his love for Mia. Accepting the responsibility to help other couples who would face the same challenges they had encountered as their relationship navigated the complex intersection of different supernatural species and the human communities that were still adapting to the reality of integration and shared existence. His transformation began immediately upon making this choice. Vampire magic and something entirely new working together to reshape his essential nature while preserving everything that made him himself, the process both painful and euphoric, as centuries of limitations dissolved and new possibilities opened before him like doors leading to unexplored territories of experience and capability. Mia's own transformation paralleled Adrian's journey as her Fey heritage fully manifested, not as a replacement for her human nature, but as an enhancement that made her capable of understanding and mediating between different forms of consciousness and existence. The ancient magic recognized her as the first heart speaker, a role that had been theoretical in Fey prophecies, but never actualized until someone with the right combination of heritage, experience, and emotional wisdom appeared at precisely the moment when supernatural society needed someone capable of advocating for relationships that transcended traditional boundaries and political calculations. Her abilities grew to encompass not just truth-sensing and protective magic, but genuine empathy that allowed her to understand the perspectives and needs of various supernatural species, while maintaining her human capacity for hope and belief in the possibility of love, conquering obstacles that seemed insurmountable to those who measured success only in terms of power and survival. The formal ceremony that celebrated their union and acknowledged their new roles in supernatural society took place in the same public square where Adrian had first knelt before Mia in response to her accidental petition. But this time, the gathering included representatives from every supernatural court in North America and beyond, their presence testament to the significance of what was being witnessed and celebrated. Elena presided over the proceedings as Vampire Queen, her authority now unquestioned after the events that had established both her legitimacy and the wisdom of the collaborative approach to supernatural governance that Adrian had pioneered and she had inherited, while Oberon represented the Fey courts that claimed Mia as their newest noble and Adrian as their first successful bridge to vampire society. Werewolf pack leaders and human government officials stood alongside ancient vampires and Fey nobility, their presence demonstrating the breadth of support for this union and the new model of supernatural human relationship that it represented for communities still learning to navigate the complexities of integration and shared existence in a world that continued to evolve faster than traditional institutions could adapt. When Adrian knelt before Mia for the second time, the gesture carried entirely different significance than the first occasion, when ancient magic and accidental invocation had bound them together through laws neither fully understood. This time his choice was made with complete knowledge of the consequences and costs. His decision to offer himself to her based on love, freely given and received, rather than magical compulsion or political necessity, while his transformed nature as a daywalker made him capable of promising her a future that transcended the traditional limitations that had made vampire-human relationships temporary by definition. The ring he placed on her finger was his original signet, transformed by the same magic that had reshaped their essential natures. The ancient metal and stone now glowing with energies that combined vampire power and fey enchantment in patterns that had never been seen before in the recorded history of supernatural artifacts and magical items. As the ring settled on her hand, it began to change shape and appearance, becoming a wedding band that looked perfectly normal to human observers, while radiating magical significance that every supernatural being present could sense and recognize as the mark of someone who had been chosen by powers beyond their current understanding. The ceremony concluded with traditional elements from both vampire and fey wedding customs, adapted to acknowledge the unprecedented nature of what was being celebrated and the new possibilities it represented for supernatural society as a whole. Ancient vows were spoken in languages that predated human civilization, while modern promises were made in English for the human officials and media representatives who documented this historic moment for audiences that included both supernatural communities and human populations still adjusting to the reality of sharing their world with beings they had previously considered mythological. Mia's family attended with expressions that ranged from bewilderment to awe as they witnessed their daughter, whom they had dismissed as a hopeless romantic with unrealistic expectations, being crowned as supernatural royalty by a man whose love had been proven through sacrifices they were only beginning to understand. Her grandmother Chen sat in the front row with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Her knowing smile suggesting that she had always suspected this day would come, even when everyone else thought Mia's dreams of true love were naive fantasies that would lead only to disappointment and heartbreak. The transformation of public perception that accompanied their union represented a fundamental shift in how both supernatural and human communities viewed relationships that crossed species boundaries, moving from skepticism and concern to recognition that such connections could strengthen rather than weaken the social fabric that held their integrated society together. Mia and Adrian became symbols of possibility for couples who had believed their love was doomed by the practical realities of different lifespans and supernatural politics, while their story inspired changes in laws and customs that had previously made such relationships legally and socially difficult to maintain. The bookstore where their relationship began was restored and expanded into a community center where supernatural human couples could seek advice and support, while the square where Adrian first knelt became a pilgrimage site for those seeking to understand how love could triumph over seemingly insurmountable obstacles when two people chose to fight for their connection rather than accepting that differences made lasting happiness impossible. Their new roles as advocates and mediators for supernatural human relationships brought them into contact with couples facing challenges similar to those they had overcome, each case requiring careful navigation of legal frameworks and cultural expectations that were still evolving as integrated society learned to accommodate forms of love and family that transcended traditional categories and definitions. Mia's abilities as heart speaker proved invaluable in these situations. Her capacity for compelling truth and sensing genuine emotion allowing her to cut through misunderstandings and political complications that often masked deeper issues of fear and mistrust between communities that were still learning to see each other as potential partners rather than threats or resources to be managed. Adrian's transformation into a daywalker made him uniquely qualified to understand the perspectives of both supernatural beings who feared losing their essential nature through integration and humans who worried about being overwhelmed or replaced by species with abilities and lifespans that dwarfed mortal capabilities. The first cases they handled together established precedents that would influence supernatural law for generations to come. Their success in helping other couples navigate similar challenges, proving that love between species was not an anomaly to be tolerated, but a strength to be celebrated and supported through appropriate legal and social frameworks. A werewolf-human marriage that had been threatened by pack politics and mortality concerns found stability through legal innovations that acknowledged both partners' needs and contributions, while a fae-vampire relationship that had seemed impossible due to conflicting magical natures discovered new forms of bonding that honored both traditions without requiring either party to sacrifice their essential identity. Each success built on previous achievements, creating a body of practical knowledge and legal precedent that made future supernatural human relationships easier to navigate and more likely to thrive, despite the challenges that remained inherent in bridging different forms of existence and consciousness. The political implications of their work extended far beyond individual relationships, as their success in fostering supernatural human integration influenced broader policies and attitudes about the direction of post-Revelation society. Elena's vampire court became a model for supernatural governance that prioritized collaboration over dominance, while Fae courts began experimenting with forms of democratic participation that had previously been considered incompatible with their hierarchical traditions and emphasis on individual bargaining rather than collective decision-making. Human governments found themselves adapting laws and institutions to accommodate supernatural citizens whose needs and capabilities required new approaches to everything from taxation and military service to education and healthcare. While supernatural communities discovered that integration offered opportunities for growth and change that isolation had never provided. As months passed and their reputation as supernatural relationship counselors grew, Mia and Adrian found themselves at the center of a quiet revolution that was transforming both supernatural and human society in ways that political leaders and ancient powers had never anticipated. Their public appearances drew crowds of curious observers and hopeful couples, while their private consultations helped reshape legal frameworks and cultural expectations that had seemed permanently fixed until love proved capable of changing rules that had governed supernatural society for millennia. Walking through Seattle's integrated districts, they were greeted by supernatural and human citizens who saw them as proof that the promises of the revelation could be fulfilled through personal commitment and mutual understanding, rather than just political treaties and legal mandates. Their presence reminding everyone that the future of integrated society depended not on grand gestures or institutional changes, but on individual choices to build bridges across differences that had once seemed unbridgeable. The story that began with coffee spilled on a vampire king's jacket had become something far larger than either Mia or Adrian had imagined possible. Their accidental meeting transforming into a love story that reshaped supernatural politics and human understanding of what was possible when two people chose each other, despite every practical reason why their relationship should fail. Standing together in the city they now protected and served, surrounded by communities that had learned to see love as strength rather than weakness. They represented hope for a future where connection transcended the boundaries that had once divided species and worlds into separate realms of existence. Their story continued to unfold with each new couple they helped and every barrier they dismantled through patient work an unwavering commitment to the belief that love was indeed the most powerful force in any universe, capable of changing not just individual lives, but the fundamental structures that governed how different forms of consciousness related to each other and built shared futures worth protecting and preserving for generations yet to come.